All right. The war from its beginning to the end. Okay, so the Scheifelen plan, developed by Baron von Scheifelen. He made it in the early 1900s, right after France and Russia allied themselves with each other in 1894. Um, Germany's high command was basically having a panic attack. Like, this war is going to happen. It's definitely going to happen. We don't know when it's going to happen, but Russia and France are both going to attack us, and we're not going to be able to fight a two-front war, which means we are the ones that have to strike first because we cannot fight. We cannot survive a two-front war. We will be defeated in such a war. So Baron von Scheifelen, Supreme Commander of the German Army, the man that would take over him would be General Helmut von Moltke, not the same Moltke that saw over the Battle of Sedan during the Franco-Prussian War. This is a different man. This is the same name. But Baron von Scheifelen said we had to strike France very quickly, like a hammer, by going through Belgium. Because the idea was that Belgium has weaker fortresses and defenses, fortifications. So if we bypass Belgium, we can easily get into France, occupy the capital, Paris, and then turn our army around and fight a war against Russia. Um, this does not go according to plan. It ends in stalemate. It could have almost worked. Um, is Liege here? Yeah. So it um I don't know. I have different views on this. It could have worked. So some historians differ on this. So the Scheifelen plan, Baron von Scheifelen died before this plan was enacted, of course, because he died in 1904, 1906, around then. And General Helmut von Moltke took over the German army. And when this plan finally became enacted during the war, he changed it up. He diverted it was supposed to be like a hammer. We go through Belgium very quickly, more so on the west than the should I say west than the east, north here. We focus our all our resources in the first and second armies right here. You can see right here, and then we go in through like a hammer, and we keep the side weak. We do have troops here reserved here, but most of our troops come in like a hammer through France, through Belgium, hidden France. He split the troops more evenly, Helmut von Moltke, 50-50 sort of, because the advance here further down south was very kicking, uh, beating the French up. So in the beginning of this battle, the French did go on the offensive. The French developed this concept called the code of the offensive, where the idea was that the French army was going to win by high morale. We're going to defeat the Germans with our high morale, fixed bayonets, going and charging. And this proved to be very fatal early on in the war because they didn't, unlike the French, unlike the Germans, they didn't focus on artillery, and this was going to be the future of warfare, artillery. Um, so Germans had heavy artillery, the French did not. So the French would be completely packed and kicking. And this is what happened during the invasion of Belgium. The Fortress of Liege, partly in thanks to General Erich Ludendorff, he would be promoted and sent to the Eastern Front after capturing the citadel. The center of the fortresses around Liege is basically this huge ground of fortresses. But it wasn't mainly because of Erich Ludendorff. It was also because of artillery. The fortresses were completely demolished from the artillery. This was no longer the era of fortress warfare. This is the era of heavy weapons. And the French, they went on the offensive too when the Germans declared war. The French would be sent back in what was called the Great Retreat. You can see here this line. They go through the Germans coming through France very easy peasy because of the artillery. And there was almost a complete moral collapse in the French army under General Joseph Joffre. Um, but after Belgium was invaded, England figured that, oh man, the French without us are definitely going to lose this war. And this concept of balance of the power. We don't want anyone threaten our control of the world seas and the world, our dominance over world trade. This is our power, no one else's. So, and the Germans were um, competing with the British with their navy, so they saw them as their main rival during this period. So they saw the Germans winning against the French. Oh, that's a big no-no. So the British sent an expeditionary force. They found their excuse for Belgium. They attacked a neutral country, which violated Treaty of London. You have violated this, and now we have our excuse to go to war. A lot of British within the cabinet refused to vote on war. They resigned, and many of the reluctant ones still said yes, particularly David Lloyd George, which I might talk about a little bit in the next few slides. Um, Britain declared war on Germany, and they sent an expeditionary force. Um, it was the highest trained. They were probably the highly trained troops in the world at that point because they're the most experienced ones in Britain's wars of imperialism. The Germans referred when they shot like they were firing machine guns. That's how the Germans referred to the British Expeditionary Force. The problem was that it was very tiny, and the Great Retreat, because of the Great Retreat, basically the French army was completely incapable of fighting against Germany's heavy artillery. They were losing hundreds of thousands. This sparked the Great Retreat. And the British Expeditionary Force got caught up in that. They lost a lot of troops. Um, the man in charge of the British Expeditionary Force, John French, he wanted to completely abandon the French. He's like, these people do not know what they're doing. Um, but it ends up becoming a stalemate. Um, I forgot his name, Joseph Gallieni, Joseph Gallieni. He focused on creating a new French army. France was put into a state of panic, but he created a new French army from Paris. He put it out onto the field, and during the Great Retreat, French army completely repositioned itself, particularly around Verdun, right? Focus our lines behind fortifications into defensive positions. And the Germans realized they were overstretched. What they didn't realize was that they were very close to capturing the capital, Paris. The first German army, led by Alexander von Kluck, his army was just a couple of miles away from Paris. The problem was he overstretched. He was about 50 miles away from Germany's second army, which means they couldn't come in if the German first army ended up being encircled. Except the French Sixth Army was completely destroyed in the First Battle of the Marne. So he could have captured Paris. It's just that he wasn't aware of this fact. That intel was not made aware to him. Um, but it was very close. So and then it ends up in a stalemate, the First Battle of Marne. But it was way more bloody for the French and the British than the Germans. So the beginning of the war looks very bad. Um, and it's going to look even worse here with the Battle of Tannenberg on the Eastern Front. The Russians unexpectedly to the Germans were heavily mobilized. They were able to quickly mobilize armies way huger than the Germans. Austria-Hungary's in this war too, remember. This is General Paul von Hindenburg and Commander-in-Chief of Austria-Hungary's army, Franz Conrad. Unexpectedly, I forgot his name, Sazonov, Russia's first army, I think. Um, the Russians were overconfident. They thought the Germans were on the retreat, and they technically were. They were repositioning themselves because they didn't expect the Russians to be so quickly mobilized. Um, but basically, Sazonov became very full of himself. Oh, this is Paul von Hindenburg is giving the credit to the Battle of Tannenberg, but it was really Erich Ludendorff's stratagem. Basically, they were tricked that the Germans were on the retreat, the Russian armies, and they weren't. They were repositioned to completely encircle Sazonov. So basically, just like how the Germans were afraid of being overstretched. Coordination. Coordination is everything with these huge armies, right? Um, Sazonov overstretched from, I think it was General Kuropatkin, the Second Army, Russia's Second Army. He overstretched, and the Germans became aware of this under Erich Ludendorff and Paul of Hindenburg. Sazonov went on the offensive, and he ended up being completely surrounded. Kuropatkin suffered huge casualties in initial offensives, and he was still recovering from that. Sazonov, his army is completely surrounded. He commits suicide in the forest. And the Russian army, to be aware, is way more enormous than the German army. It's just that they're not as modernized. They're peasants. Some soldiers don't even have shoes or weapons, rifles. So this is Russia's army is huge. It's just that the reality is this is the common reality that Russia is not a modern nation. Um, However, while this is very embarrassing for Russia, the Battle of Tannenberg, um, they do capture Galicia, much of Galicia. Franz Conrad ends up losing his favorite son in one of the battles in the Ukraine, and one of his other sons ends up seriously ill. It's completely disastrous. He sends Austria-Hungary's army on defensives against Russia's armies, and they end up being completely mauled. Russia is completely conquering Galicia. The only thing that's stopping them from completely conquering the region is the coming winter in the Carpathian Mountains. And what's even more embarrassing is Franz Conrad's invasion of Serbia. The first invasion fails, second invasion fails, the third invasion fails. Completely embarrassing. This tiny nation of Serbia it completely defends itself. So this is the first year of the war. Not so good. Doesn't look so good for the Allied powers. And this is where the Battle of Gallipoli comes in. They weren't expecting the Allied powers, particularly Britain. They were not expecting the war to be so deadly. Um, so this is the search for elsewhere. This is the Dardanelles Straits. This is the Gallipoli Peninsula. Over here, you could see it. It's very tiny on this map. It's the first straits into the Straits of Constantinople. The search for elsewhere. This idea. So the Ottoman Empire ends up getting into this battle. So Russia has for centuries wanted the jewel of the Mediterranean, Constantinople, right? And throughout the 1800s, France and Britain are slowly dividing up the Ottoman Empire for themselves. So they're all in alliance with each other. What does this mean for the Ottoman Empire? The Ottoman Empire is more financially connected to the Germans, but Navy, Britain was helping the Young Turks build their new navy. But what ends up happening is that Britain refuses. They were building two dreadnoughts for the Young Turks, but when the war breaks out, they refuse to send these two completed dreadnoughts to the Young Turks. And then also, Britain demands Turkey or the Ottoman Empire that they don't allow German boats and some U-boats go through their straits. Um, this ends up being war. Um, this basically ends up, having the Ottoman Empire reluctantly, because they know they're in no position for war, reluctantly join with Germany and Austria-Hungary in the war. So this is a search for elsewhere. We're going to invade, since Britain dominates the world seas. They have the advantage in that they could reposition armies wherever they want. Basically, um, the the Russians and the French completely surround Germany on east and west, and the Baltics, the British completely dominate the Baltic Sea. Excuse me. So this is a search for elsewhere. Lord Secretary of the Navy, Winston Churchill, young photo of him right here. The idea was that it was going to be a naval expedition originally. And we're going to sail straight through the straits, straight to Constantinople. Except early on, um, under General Otto von Sanders, he's a German general that took control of the Turks' army because it was completely incompetent and needs serious reforms. Um, I don't remember all of it, but basically, they filled the Darnell Straits with mines, and the Navy didn't want to send their Navy. Navy's like, oh, we need to change the plans because we don't want our Navy destroyed. Um, Initial moments, number of ships were destroyed, and these ships are very expensive to make. Except they completely fill the Dardanelles Straits with mines, but the British Navy didn't want to risk it. Winston Churchill did. He's like, we can sail straight into Constantinople. It's going to cost some of our ships. Well, we should do it. The British Navy wouldn't budge. He was outvoted, and it became a land campaign. We're going to invade by land. Um, and that ends up being a complete failure. Gallipoli campaign lasts for about a year. There's three separate attempts to invade the Gallipoli Peninsula. General Mustafa Kemal would become known as Ataturk. Um, he defends the Gallipoli Peninsula against the British, particularly Anzac troops, Australians and New Zealanders. Uh, they they occupy three different positions. They bring Australian New Zealand troops over from Australasia to Egypt, which you can see right here from the Red Sea. They transport them to Gallipoli right here and nearby islands. Um, and what ends up happening as soon as they land, um, this is really more about incompetence among British generals. Um, Once they land on the coast, they slowly move, very slow, and this gives the Turkish army, particularly General Mustafa Kemal, the chance to counterattack any landings. So this is the search for elsewhere. Like we have to get away from this trench warfare that we saw during August. Um, this trench warfare that ended up developing in summer and fall. You have to get away from this. And this ends up being, I forgot to talk about the first battle yet, but oh no. This ends up being another trench warfare, and this is completely disastrous. It ends up being nowhere. It's another trench warfare area. Um, so this is the far furthest extinct the British got. Um, but the idea was that once we capture these Turkish territories, we can have a free front warfare of Russia, France, and down here in the south. Complete failure, completely disastrous. Lasts for about a year. So many deaths. The Turkish lost a lot of troops as well, but Mustafa Kemal saved Gallipoli for the Turks. I don't order you to attack. I order you to die. um, could this have succeeded if the Navy sailed straight to Constantinople? Maybe, because there was a complete moral collapse within the Turkish people. So many refugees were fleeing Constantinople, like, oh, the city's gonna fall. This is one of many events that build up to the Armenian genocide. Um, but this was completely disastrous for the British. Winston Churchill was sacked from as Lord Secretary of the Navy. He was sent packing in tears. However, he was good friends with David Lloyd George. So when he became prime minister, Winston Churchill was brought back as Minister of Ammunitions. And Winston Churchill did another thing was he was the main promoter of financing the invention, this innovation, the tank. He was the main promoter of this. Not a completely bad man. He's pretty good. Um, I mean, competent, not incompetent. So this was a complete disaster. Could have had ended differently. I don't know. Um, and if Britain even had more competent generals during the Gallipoli campaign, would they have really gotten further than they had in the coast? Yes, but would that have meant, oh, this wouldn't have been trench warfare? I don't know. I can't say that. Um, who knows? But the Young Turk, they took over before World War One. Their idea was we're going to reform the Ottoman Empire. It was crumbling throughout the 1800s. We are the sick man of Europe. We're going to change that. Um, and as soon as they take control, all these disastrous things happen. For the Young Turks, they lose the Balkans. They're completely kicked out of the Balkans. And then World War One with Constantinople, these Arab uprisings. It's embarrassing. We took control of this government. We young military officers under Enver Pasha to fix our corrupt government, make it better, and it's just going downhill. So after they're kicked out of the Balkans, their main ethnic Christian populace, most of their Christian populace was in the Balkans, but now they're gone, and their main Christian populace were the Armenians. See Armenia here for centuries. It was divided between the Russians in the Caucasus and the Turks here in Armenia. This becomes another war front, the Caucasus and between the Russians and the Turks. So this is Young Turks also embody this strong ethnic nationalism. So they basically mass murdered Armenians. And the ironic thing was that the Armenians, there were a significant number of Armenians that fought for the Ottoman Empire during the war. So this went on during the war. Um, Vast majority of the Armenians would be murdered. All the men murdered, sent to labor camps. The Armenian army, the Armenian troops that fought for the Turks were ordered to disarm themselves, sent to labor camps, many killed, women sold into slavery. Between 600,000 to 1.2 million of the empire's 1.5 million Armenians died. Um, who was his name? U.S. Secretary of State Lanson referred to this as the blackest history of this war. Um, this is very, you know, this is very sad. Um, Young Turks. Um, there you go. So yeah, um, so all fiends were bad in the first year of the war for Austria-Hungary. They were completely incompetent. The Germans basically take over for Austria-Hungary's troops. They're made in charge. I'm already exhausted from talking. They're made in charge under Alexander Maxenson, also referred to as the last Hussar. Right, this is the age of machine guns and artillery. These are cavalrymen. This the era of cavalry is over. The last Hussar, but he basically he took control of the Austria-Hungary's armies, and he basically led the campaign, the offensive to retake Galatia, the province of Galatia. And what ends up happening, Eric Ludendorff, Paul von Hindenburg, and Alexander Mackinson, they realize that Poland is completely surrounded. Free front war. We can have a front war against the Russians now. So once the Russians realize this, so they basically do a great retreat from Poland. Like it's inevitable because they stage a free front offensive against the Russians. We have to have a tactical withdrawal. And it was during this period where the Russian army committed mass pogroms, mass executions of Russian Jews. Um, Genocide. um, I'm forgetting something, but this looks very bad. Like there's a tactical move, but it looks really bad for the Russians. And it was just during this period that Tsar Nicholas II takes personal command from Grand Duke Nicholas over the Russian army. Russian army is completely corrupt and incompetent, um, total losers. Oh, so I made this cheat sheet for me. I forgot about that. um, did I put anything here? Okay. I didn't start that yet. So first year, 1914, second year, 1915 looks really bad for the Triple Entente. Um, very bad. Um, the Italians. So they were originally allied to battles in zone. So they were originally, let me see if okay, I look back on that again. They were originally allied to the Germans and Austria-Hungary, except Austria-Hungary were the ones that started this whole Great War because they declared war on Serbia. And we're in a defensive alliance. We're not in an offensive alliance. It's a defensive one. So we don't really have to come to Austria-Hungary and Germany's aid because this is a defensive alliance. So they waited the first and a half year of the war to determine which side was better to join. Um, and was fought whichever side they joined, uh, that would turn the tide of this entire war to their favor, which is completely would turn out completely false. But this really put Austria-Hungary in a panic. Franz Conrad and what was his name, Count Berchtold, they fought of gambling away our Italy wanted territory from Austria-Hungary. They were really the country territory they wanted, and they fought of gambling away some of their territories to have Italy join them. Emperor Franz Joseph had Count Berchtold dismissed for such ideas. Um, so Italy joined France and Britain in the secret Treaty of London, and they went on the offensive here, right here. The battle has been Zonzo against Austria-Hungary, leads to completely nothing, complete stalemate, trench warfare. Just seen very much like seen in over here after the first battle of Marne, the August offensive, and then Serbia. So they fended away from free invasions, completely embarrassing for Austria-Hungary. But what ends up happening is Bulgarians joined the Germans in Austria-Hungary. They're very pissed off from the Balkans War, first and second, well, not yeah, the first and second Balkans War, where they ended up losing territories they saw as theirs from Serbia and Greece. So they join. So they join along with Germany and Austria-Hungary and completely invade Serbia. And this is Serbia's great retreat. Russia, France has one, so does Serbia. And Serbian government and its populace are sent back into the island of Corfu. I believe that's Corfu. They go through Albania, um, complete chaos. They're completely running for their lives. Um, and while the Gallipoli campaign ended in complete failure, there is a Saloniki campaign today that says called Thessaloniki in Greece. It's basically complete standstill right around here. So Serbia is completely overtaken. Italy joins the war. 1915. 1916. Okay. Battle of Verdun. Can I pause? Okay, the Battle of Verdun. 1914, 1915 done. 1916. This would be the longest war in the history. I mean, in the history of World War I, this is the longest battle, one of the deadliest. And this is the idea of Erich von Falkenhayn. So after the Schlieffen plan ended in total failure, Helmuth von Moltke was dismissed, and the war minister Falkenhayn became commander in chief of the German army. And there was basically infighting in the high command of Germany's military between him and Paul von Hindenburg's team of him, Max Hoffman, and Erich Ludendorff. Paul Hindenburg and Ludendorff believed the war would be won in the east first against the Russians. They're incompetent. We'll defeat them first before the French. Then we can turn our soldiers around to the west. Let's concentrate our soldiers in the east, not in the west. Falkenhayn disagreed. He believed the war would be won against the French first. In retrospect, would it have made a difference? Maybe it might have made a difference. But he's in charge, Falkenhayn, so he is the one that gets the main stratagem, not Hindenburg and not Hindenburg and Ludendorff. They would later on. And this was Falkenhayn wasn't a stupid man. He was very intelligent. Um, he was aware that there was going to be a revolution in Russia. Um, and it wasn't a foolish stratagem because he realized this war is not about controlling territory. This is about the war of attrition. Who is going to be the one that's going to be down to the last man standing? This is a war about troops being killed. Who is going to kill the most people? This is a morale war. And this was realized during the American Civil War as well. This isn't about territory. This is about morale and number of troops you have available. Um, so his idea was Verdun is very nationalistic. You can see Verdun right here on the map. This is a very nationalist point for the French, very historic fortress city. Um, so idea was that we're going to capture this, and the French are going to refuse this capture. They're going to attack the fortress until they reconquer it. So this is Falkenhayn's idea of bleeding France white, bleeding them white to death, to their vanished blank point. Um, we're going to capture Verdun, which is weakly fortified at the moment, and then we're going to station artillery here. And whatever side went on the offensive, were always the ones that ended up losing the more troops. So the idea is that we're going to keep the French on the offensive, and we're not going to have our German infantry on the offensive. So they're always going to be the ones losing more casualties because they're always going to be the ones on the offensive, right? Because they're going to be the ones witnessing our artillery and machine guns, not us. So this is a smart concept. Ended up in failure because Verdun was never captured. A few fortresses were captured. One of Falkenhayn's mistakes was only ordering an offensive, and the general that undersaw this was the Crown Prince Wilhelm. He only so this is the River Meuse. Only one of the banks. You could have had West Bank and East Bank troops go both on the defensive, but only one of the banks went on the defensive. I think it was the West Bank. Yeah, West Bank. Only one of the banks had troops going the defensive. But if both troops, the reserve troops on the East Bank, they weren't put on the defensive. But if both banks had troops going defensive, and Verdun at the beginning of the battle was not very heavily fortified, which is why the Germans had an easy time going on the offensive initially. Oops. So the beginning of the battle looked bad for the French. That is until the General Philippe Pétain. So at the beginning of the war, he was completely obscure outsider. He was put in the sidelines because he didn't believe in the French cult of the offensive, which almost cost the French the war early on. But he proved to be he was an old man. He was on the brink of retirement, Philippe Pétain. And then this war broke out, and he was a colonel at the beginning, and he proved to be highly competent. He knew how to organize troops and how to focus on strategic points. Where we focus our garrisons, our artillery. How do we do all this? He was a very competent man. The French were advised, even at the time, it was General Joseph Joffre who also adopted this idea of offensive warfare, controlling all territory at all costs. Philip Pétain didn't really subscribe to this offensive idea, and he turned if it wasn't him, Philip Pétain put in charge of this battle for the French, who knows what would happen. But he turned the battle over for the French into a defensive warfare. This isn't about capturing territory. This is about losing as little men as possible. So he took artillery into defensive positions and the troops. He had troops cycled in and out. He built heavily fortified roads, systems for supplies. He did his best to keep morale high among the troops. Um, what was I saying? Let me see if I wrote notes first. Um, I'll talk about it later. But he saved Verdun for the French. Except towards the end of the battle, he was replaced by Joseph Joffre with Robert Nivelle, who I'll get into later on. He became the hero of Verdun. But he pissed off Joseph Joffre because he never went on an offensive. He never subscribed to this idea of offensive warfare. And Falkenhayn's plan ended in debacle. It never really materialized like he hoped it would because of Philip and Pétain. In part, there's a few other reasons why. Um, Once it was apparent that Falkenhayn's plan wasn't going to go anywhere, they made the decision to keep the battle going when they didn't have to, the Germans. Um, but Philip Pétain saved it, and then he was replaced. He was thrown somewhere to the sides, and Robert Nivelle and his general Butcher Mangan, known for the butcher because he always sent his troops on reckless offensives and had them killed and put them in vulnerable positions of artillery fire. Um, but this is one of the deadliest battles of the war, um, which you would talk about in like a trench warfare lesson concept. Um, okay, so this is the Battle of Jutland. This before World War II. This is the biggest naval encounter in world history, and it was unexpected. The German's high seas fleet was avoiding battle with the Britain fleet because they were, quite simply put, outnumbered. And if they had a constant engagement, they were eventually going to lose all their troops. So this was unexpected. Both both British fleet, both the British fleet and German fleet were sent to expect a neutral Danish vessel, and then they both ended up meeting each other in the battle in the North Sea. And they went to battle. There was only like two engagements and only lasted for like 15 minutes. And I have casualties here. It was actually a worse battle for the British, but the British were able to claim victory because their fleet was simply huger than the Germans. It was a good. The Germans could technically claim victory, but they couldn't risk constant engagements with the British because, first of all, these vessels are very expensive to make, cost millions of dollars, and it wasn't worth it. The risk it wasn't worth it. We're simply not going to take control of any seas at all. We just don't. We just There's no reality to it. So the Germans instead focused on submarine warfare. They didn't really have a submarine fleet at the beginning of the war. Throughout the war, they began building up their submarine fleets. And unlike the British, they focused on submarine warfare for that reason, because the British control the seas, we don't. So we're going to focus on torpedo warfare. And the British didn't, because the German fleet isn't going anywhere. There's no confirm. They're completely blockaded. So unlike the British, the Germans had submarine fleets built up, and they hurt British commercial shipping lines. Except the Germans don't have are completely blockaded. So this war is, in terms of morale, is going much worse for the Germans in Austria-Hungary because they're completely surrounded and there's no trade going on. So this war attrition is so far much worse for the Germans, which is part of the reason why Falkenhayn was looking for a battle like this, a morale victory, a quick morale victory where we lose less troops than the British and the French, which ended in a failure, and he was kicked out as a commander in chief for this reason. So, so in the Battle of Verdun, I think I made a mistake. Let me see what year this happened. Yeah, I made a mistake. This is after. There we go. But yeah, he went on the offensive during the Battle of the Somme. But basically, when the Battle of Verdun was going on, the French pleaded the Russians, um, go on the offensive during the Battle of Verdun. Go on the offensive. It ends in complete failure, complete debacle. What's called the Lake Norak offensive. Basically, so Russian generals are known for being completely incompetent. They're imperial nobles, all related to the Tsar, and they don't know anything about military stratagem. And they basically ordered an artillery fire. This is separate artillery fire in basically wasteful land. There was no troops there. There was no German troops occupying the land. So the offensive looked like it was going well in the first few days. And then a bunch of Russian troops literally froze to death. Ludendorff and Hindenburg ordered an offensive. I forgot the name of the colonel that made this military strategy because it would be used throughout the war after it was created. Artillery general, I forgot his name, Bruckmuller or something like that, um, called Creeping Barrage. Russians went on offensive. They needed diversion because of the Battle of Verdun. Like, we're losing troops here. Have the Germans, divert some troops. Um, Brusilov offensive also. I don't know. I forget. Hold on. Okay, so I figured it out. I was right to put this slide here because the Brusilov offensive also went on there in 1916. But the Lake Norak offensives ended in complete debacle originally, somewhere around here, Lake Norak. I think that's it. I don't know. Too hard to see. Um, those ended in complete failure because Germans went on a quick counteroffensive using what is called the creeping barrage. So basically, Germans rain artillery down as like a protective shield as the German troops slowly advance. So that prevents Russian artillery from hurting them and Russian troops advancing because of the creeping barrage. So basically, after the Lake North offensive, a bunch of Russia's generals are like, "Oh my God, we're completely hopeless. This war is over for us." Completely demoralized. But then Alexei Brusilov, he's from the imperial court, Russian nobility as well. Kept unlike a vast majority of Russia's generals, he's actually competent, and he orchestrated what's called the Brusilov offensives. He had he realized modern warfare. He had Russia's armies carefully coordinate with each other and slowly move simultaneously. It was all about coordination. Um, so they didn't move it that far during 1916, 1917, 1916. They slowly advanced, but this served as a good diversion for the battle of Verdun because German troops had to be sent on this here as well. And um, so it was, but a lot of Russians died because remember, Russia's army is not modern. They're all peasants. They don't have the equipment. They're all a lot of them froze to death. They're not a modern army like these powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary. I wouldn't consider very modern either, but Germans take control over Austrian command basically. So it's limited. This is a successful campaign in 1916 under Buzalov, except Russia's generals are still completely incompetent, and so is Russia's government under Tsar Nicholas II. Russia's war minister Alexei Polovanov. So this is a story about Rasputin. He had he was very competent, this war minister, carefully supplied, with what power he had because Russia's government is completely incompetent. They have limited power. I'm doing a reading on this, writing a reading on this right now. I'm learning like, oh my God, this government is a complete shit show. Um, but he's trying to organize the war front for the Russians. And Rasputin is coming out of nowhere saying, "Oh, I need some of these cars, these automobiles for my party and shit to get away from the police." And it's like, we need Alexei Polvanov is like going to Tsarina Alexandra. We need these automobiles for the war effort. I refuse to do this for Rasputin. And basically he's dismissed. He's more very few competent administrators in Russia's government. He's one of the competent ones, and he's dismissed for this. He's like, "Oh, how dare you disobey Rasputin, my lovely Rasputin." So, Russia is still incompetent, and even though this was an achievement of Brusilov, Russia's army is not modern, and they suffer huge casualties anyway. So they're slowly going on an offensive, puts Austria-Hungary in a state of panic. Um, Not good. And then Franz Conrad, basically Franz Carlin is kept in the dark on Falkenhayn's Battle of Verdun, and he's really butthurt about this. So he has his own secret plans against the Italians since they're going to the offensive battle in zone. There's like I don't know 16, 17 battles in zones, those the river and zone. So this is Franz Conrad of idea. We're going to encircle the Italians. You begin from Trentino. We're going to insert this province here. It's Italian. What, is it Italian? No, it's Austrian. Trent. I don't know. I think it's German. I think it was German. I don't know. I think. Let me look. I have to make sure. It's Italian right now, but I think it was originally Austrian, more Austrian than Italian. I don't remember, but basically, Franz Conrad's idea is that we're going to encircle the Italian army. Except, unfortunately, Austria-Hungary's army is somehow more incompetent than the Italians. Italian army is also incompetent and is poorly equipped. But you know, Franz Conrad wasn't very secretive about this offensive, and wasn't very calculative. Very, there was very little coordination. Contrast to Buzalov, who was very coordinated with his armies. Um, he coordinated. Franz Conrad coordinated these armies from his estate, his vacation in the state. It was a one-way ticket. He didn't have correspondence with his generals that were on the Trentino campaign. So this too ends in failure. So these are a stalemate. The battles in Zonzo, and this Trentino campaign offensive, total failure. So while the Battle of Verdun is going on, the Battle of the Somme, this is British Expeditionary Force Commander Douglas Haig. This is French Commander in Chief Joseph Joffre. At the Somme River. So this was originally a French. This was supposed to be a French offensive, French-led offensive until the Battle of Verdun. So this became heavily reliant on the British with Douglas Haig. Um, disastrous, um, disastrous for a few like 7.5 miles. They went on the offensive. Basically, the idea was going to hit Germans with high explosives of artillery. We're going to bombard them with millions of shells. Except what ended up happening was Douglas Haig is an asshole, um, from what I've read. But what ended up happening with these shells, they were mass produced by unskilled laborers. So they were duds. A lot of them were duds. They're supposed to be high explosives made from nitroglycerin, but they were duds. They ended up being shrapnel. So we're going to bombard the German positions with all these shells, and it's going to force them out of their trenches. We're going to advance just like that. Yay! But they were duds, and the Germans held their trenches. Um, they thought they would be kicked out of them from this heavy bombardment, but it wasn't really a heavy bombardment. It was heavy, but it wasn't the one that was intended. Um, so that was the first era. Yeah, 2/3 and 1.5 million shrapnel high explosive. The blackest day of British Army. So the idea was like, oh, our British troops are going to easily march into the German trenches and take them over. We're going to break the trenches, the German line. Other thing about Douglas Haig though was that he thought the cavalry were still essential, and he was a complete. He had no idea what was going on. Disastrous. Um, so the idea was like, oh, they're kicked out of their trenches. So the British were ordered to slowly march and take control of the trenches. So they're just slowly marching like it's the fucking 1700s. And the German machine gunners are just like staring at the British slowly marching. They're like, can you believe this? And they're like, oh, we just fired. We just fired. They all dropped like flies. And we couldn't believe it. It looked like it was horrific as it was disastrous. The first day of the Battle of the Somme, over 60,000 casualties from such incompetence. It was disastrous. They only captured about 7.5 miles, and they had to resort to propaganda. Oh, the Germans lost just as many troops as us. No, they did not. The French and the British lost horrific numbers compared to the Germans. Um, it was a complete disaster. This is when propaganda really begins to hit the home front. So it's like, no, the Germans lost just as much. You can't tell anyways. They know they lost about half as much compared to the Allies. Terrible offensive, complete disaster. 1916 at a close. So towards the end of 1916, Romania joins because they're afraid Transylvania is going to be taken by the Russians. So Romania ends up they want Transylvania. So Romania ends up joining, which is a completely embarrassing for the Allies, for secret treaties. Um, Alexander von Mackensen. So Falkenhayn is dismissed from his post as commander in chief. He becomes general. He's ordered to the conquest of Romania, and Alexander Mackensen. They basically team up and take over Romania. Completely disastrous for the Bulgarians as well. Romania's army is completely incompetent. They're not modernized. And inefficient command, poor morale. They surrender just like that. I remember reading like trying to I forget the name of this region. Is it Berkovina? No. Is it that region? This is Bulgaria. That's Romania. Yeah, so like some forces there, like, oh, we're going to defend it just like that. And like in like 24 hours, all the troops surrendered, Romanian troops surrendered. So it was a complete disaster, completely embarrassing for the Allies when this happens. So this is disastrous. So first 2 years of the war, 1914, 1915, looked pretty bad for the Allies. The 1916 stalemate, but still looking bad for the Allies, sort of. But now this is when the tide really begins to turn. It looks bad for everyone. It looks bad for everyone because this is war of attrition. um, Battle of Transylvania. So Serbia is already kicked out. The Serbian government is already kicked out of their country. Romania makes a separate peace settlement. So after Falkenhayn is dismissed, finally, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff take over. Paul von Hindenburg, he would be future president of the German Republic, the Weimar Republic. He wasn't really the brains of the Eastern Front. It was Erich von Ludendorff, not von, because the unfortunate thing for Ludendorff is that he was too young and he wasn't of Prussian nobility. Paul von Hindenburg was. He didn't really do anything, Hindenburg. He just used Ludendorff to enhance his reputation, and Ludendorff did the military stratagems for him. Um, so Paul von Hindenburg was the face of Ludendorff because he was of Prussian nobility. Ludendorff was not; he was a commoner. And the thing about how things worked back then is that you have to be an aristocrat. This is like Douglas Haig, and the person that in charge of the British Expeditionary Force before him was John French. Douglas Haig got him kicked out. There's political maneuverings, but he was just as bad as John French, all the same. Hindenburg is an impressionist aristocrat. Erich von Ludendorff changes everything. So this is when he really gets to shine. 1917, 1918, he becomes virtual dictator of Germany, takes on his own personal title, quartermaster general, and he restructures the new defense system for Germany, German army. So basically, you can see this little space here. he has a tactical draw of the German army down here, the Hindenburg Line. And it's basically this idea of war is not about territory anymore. It's about troops, troops and morale. Who loses the most out of all of us? So he has a tactical draw. You could see this in the movie 1917, by the way. Tactical draw, have all these pillboxes. He has a city, basically a city fortress built of fortifications on the Hindenburg line. Pillboxes, they change tactics. Germans, the Allies don't. They still think it's about territory. They realize it too late. But basically, he creates this idea of diversion, military diversion. Have the Allies capture territory, wrongly convince them to capture territory, and then we have our artillery bombard them when they capture that territory that we wanted them to. So they will Hindenburg and Ludendorff realize it's not about territory anymore. This isn't a war about territory. The era of fortresses and fixed Spain, that's over. This is the new war. So he becomes commander in chief, Paul von Hindenburg, but it's really Ludendorff. The Kaiser hates him, but he has to accept him all the same. And these new military tactics, of course, prove devastating for Russia's military, and they go into revolution. In 1917. They had enough, the Russian people. This is a separate. I can't get into that. I know about all of this, but that's too much. This is Russian history. This is more of a separate topic, but there's a revolution in Russia. We've had enough. This is originally Russia supported the war, but this war has been devastating for the Russian economy and its people. They're starving and freezing to death, or men are dying. So Russia goes for revolution. It was a long time coming, except the war minister, Kerensky, he does the fatal error of keeping Russia in the war. And these new tactics, the new defense system is devastating for Russia's army. This new defense system of tricking the troops, the Allied troops, and the battles the Russians face against the Germans completely devastating. Let me see what I wrote about it. But basically, Russian troops eventually just refuse to even continue fighting. They like, we're done. We're not fighting. That's how bad it gets. And Alexei Bruzilov ends up being dismissed, but it wasn't his fault. It was already game over for the Russians by this point. And it's April 1917 that Americans finally joined the war. So they would have traded the Germans and the Americans, but the British have a blockade on the German shipping lanes. I could have talked about this for the Battle of the Somme, but I didn't. So I'm gonna keep going. The United States declared war. Was a long time coming. Not exactly, but under Ludendorff, the Germans decided to continue unrestricted submarine warfare, and a lot of American vessels ended up getting hit, and this is hurting our trade. And never silver lining, not really silver lining, but it's because the Americans are trading so much with the British and French. And the British and French are basically bankrupt by this point. They're just taking out loans at this point to pay the Americans. So the idea is if the British and the French end up being defeated, they can't pay us back. So we don't want the British and French to lose, financially speaking. And they finally find their reason for war. One of the dumbest diplomatic episodes in history, the Zimmerman telegram. The foreign minister of Germany basically says, "Hey, Mexico, go declare war on the United States for us. Make sure they don't get into the war because we know we're bombing the shit out of their American vessels with our torpedoes. Why don't you divert them for us? We promise you territory. Well, Mexico's going for their own civil war at this point. They're in no position to wage a war. And he's like, "Oh, I know all about Mexican history." Let me see how I wrote this. I'll read it. We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the United States out of America, keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, general financial support, and understanding our part of Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The settlement in detail is left to you. You will inform President of above most secretly as soon as the outbreak of war with the United States of America is certain, and add the suggestion that he should, on his own initiative, invite Japan to lead adherence and at the same time mediate between Japan and ourselves. Please call the President's attention to the fact that the ruthless employment of our submarines now offer the prospect of compelling England in a few months to make peace. So a few things on this. Relations between the United States and Japanese were not exactly gung ho, happy, friendly. They were rivals in the Pacific, which is why he's saying this. And Zimmerman, complete doofus, but he is. There is one point about this history is that the U.S.-Mexican War of 1846-1848 is in Mexican history called the Great North American Invasion because they did nothing to cause that war except abolish slavery in Mexico. We abolish slavery. How dare you? um, you see contradictions in American history's series of hypocrisies and contradictions. But it's like, did he really send this? The British decoded this, but they didn't want the Germans to know that they coded their telegram secret code, secret codes. But the British revealed this to the Americans, they couldn't believe it. This is so ridiculous. And then when Zimmerman was asked by Foreign Secretary Press, he actually sent this telegram. He's like, "Yeah, why wouldn't I? Of course I sent this. Why wouldn't I? This is so it's like on this basis, as ridiculous as it is, we're declaring war on Germany. There you have it. I need to pause. I'm tired. Never offensive. So this is going back to the Battle of Verdun. He is replaced with, he replaces Philip Pétain towards the end of the battle, and he raises himself to fame because of it. Except his idea of offensive is disastrous. He somehow gets the support of Prime Minister David Lloyd George and he's a political favorite. He gets the support of the British and the French governments on this. This is supposed to be a dual offensive with French doing it mainly. Naval offensive and the Chemin de the names. And he uses what's he kindly called the massive maneuver. Wait for the enemy to expose their flanks and then have reserve troops on defensive when they expose their flanks. Except this is what he used in the Battle of Verdun towards the end. Except that when he was using this strategy, Germans were retreating anyways. They weren't holding the lines at all. So, and not only this, when he's going to use this in his offensive 1917, and during this period, Ludendorff's new defense system is being used. Right, I didn't really go into it full detail as I should have. The new defense, a real front line would be in the rear beyond the reach of enemy artillery. Another line exists behind the second one to prepare for a counterattack. Germans wanted the Allies to take territory. So this is a new defense system. So now this massive maneuver idea is completely useless because they're in this defensive. They never really exposed their flanks for such strategies to even work. It only worked in the Battle of Verdun because Germans were retreating, they gave up. Um, so this ends up this battle, this is trench warfare 101, offensive warfare, where the offensive uh, party always ends up getting more casualties. The French have enough. The French army begins to mutiny after this debacle. Neville is dismissed. He refuses to leave his position. They have to bring Philip Pétain back in, promising troops they're able to go back to the home front for a bit. We're going to rotate you. We're going to give you better shelter. We're going to give you better food and rations. Philip Pétain is going around. He's temporarily put in charge as commander in chief. Temporarily, he's not well liked by Georges Clemenceau Horford and Folk would eventually take his position. But after this offensive, um, French army mutinies, and if the Germans went on the offensive during these mutinies, who knows what would happen? The French might have left the Germans. Who knows? Um, so this is disastrous. And then there's another one, another debacle of trench warfare, the Battle of Passchendaele. This is going on over here in the north, around Flanders. This is supposed to be both an amphibious offensive and land offensive combined. But the land offensive, of course, whenever these battles occur, like Battle of Verdun, Battle of Somme, Battle naval offensives, they make very little gains in terms of ground, and the they never reached the waters. I forgot the name of the river. They never really reached the position they wanted to do with it. They wanted to get to, so they could never launch the amphibious expedition. And part of the reason why is because during this battle, the weather. So this is one of the key battles where weather and the geography makes all the difference. Flanders, it's very muddy, it's very marshland. And after years of artillery, Belgium's drainage, its sewer system is completely destroyed. So when the weather season finally hits during this year, the land is completely destroyed. It's completely marshland, soggy. So they do make a few gains in grounds, but both sides lose about 250,000 lives each for mostly nothing. And it was during this battle, though, that General Herbert Plumer figured out Udendore's strategy, his new defense system. They want us to take the territory. So here's what we're going to do. We're not going to take it. So he figures it out, and then we're just gonna stay where we advance. We're not gonna take this new territory the Germans are trying to make us take, and then we're gonna launch our artillery instead. So the Germans are shocked that they finally figured it out. What we're gonna do now? But the war is almost over by this point. And then Lieutenant General Arthur Currie. It's also during this war that the Australians, the Canadians, and New Zealand, not oh yeah, New Zealanders, the Anzacs and the Canadians. They're now basically taking the British place as the frontline troops now, because the British are like, oh, our morale is bad. We lose so many troops. Let these lesser let our imperial subjects handle dirty work. So Lieutenant General Arthur Currie, he's like, this is going to cost so many lives. This advance is going to be completely pointless. We lose about 17,000 people for I forgot the advance to for Ypres, I think. And he ends up being right. I'm going to lose 17,000 of my men for this offensive. He's a he's a Canadian, I think, Arthur Currie. Oh man, wait. Yeah, so this is another mastermind, Douglas Haig, disaster like the Battle of the Somme. He's still in charge after the Battle of the Somme. Um, I should mention Joseph Joffre was placed with this guy, then Philip Pétain, because of the disastrous Battle of the Somme. Douglas Haig isn't really, because British aristocrats still have heavy influence in politics, more so than like in the France realm of politics. It's much more. people centered in France and Britain. Um, Prime Minister David Lloyd George saw this as a worthless battle. This is going to be throwing away lives for no reason. And he was right. Um, so he's in charge of the war cabinet, and he tries every time to prevent um, the British from wasting lives under Douglas Haig. He is an incompetent man, Douglas Haig. Um, so there was a few key moments that were unfolded in this. Um, yeah, this is when I mentioned all of it. Okay. So meanwhile, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, they're completely done with the war. They're completely wiped out. Romania, um, completely surrendered. They're making a separate peace settlement with the Germans. Treaty Brest-Litovsk. The Russians lose all this territory. Before the Social Democrats under Kerensky wouldn't surrender because they could not accept the loss of Poland. This piece of Poland, is Russian to us. We could not accept this. But now the Russians are accepting because they're advancing on to St. Petersburg, the Germans. They don't have a choice at this point. And it's a very embarrassing peace settlement, this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And the Treaty of Bucharest, basically, Romania is completely stripped clean by the Germans. Um, and to the Allied powers, this is evidence that we can't have a peaceful settlement. We can't have diplomacy yet. These people are barbaric, and this is our proof. And Ludendorff, let me see if I mentioned any of it. Ludendorff was expansionist. There were plans leaked that the Germans wanted to deindustrialize the French economy. We're going to turn them back into the great economy, turn them into a personal fiefdom, basically. Um, these French lands. So they were expansionist, very Prussian in character, you could say. Meanwhile, in the East, the Middle East, Ottoman Empire, um, the Arabs are convinced to revolt, and the British are sending their troops from India. Um, so the Arabs are revolting. So their own people of the Ottoman Empire, they're revolting against the Turks. So it's basically cut clean end of story kind of deal where the Ottomans are going to lose a series of battles and supplies. Earlier on in the first years of the war, they attempt to invade Egypt to encourage an uprising that ends up failing. But Britain's position in Egypt is very weak, so there are some permanent effects because of this. And there is Egyptian outcall for independence and an anti-British rule that doesn't fully work out. It's partially successful. Um, Ludendorff's last throw. So Ludendorff realizes that Germany is on the last days of its foot. Um, they change some strategies around. Um, Operation Michael. We're going to divide British command and French command. We're going to divide these two troops, and then once we cut clean through them, divide the French and the British. We're going to push the British out through Flanders. We're going to push them out, and then we're going to go and continue encircling the Germans. So this is Ludendorff's last straw. He knows this is the end of the war if we don't do this, because for the last 4 years, Germany has been suffering from this blockade from trade. They're completely out of rubber, so Germans are now having their tires made out of steel, which is completely destroying their roads. People are starving in hundreds of thousands. So this is Ludendorff's last straw, and he well knows it. Um, so that's his idea. We're going to divert, and he does get pretty far. He does get pretty far. He causes a moral crisis within British and French command, and they realize they need supreme command leader. And Ferdinand Foch is the man for the job, with George Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France, backing him. So this is German spring offensive. This is how far they get. The idea was to capture Amiens. They didn't do that. And the second idea was Chemin de Reims around here. We're going to use this offensive as a diversion so that we can advance in the Ypres. Ferdinand Folk realizes this, and Ludendorff wants to reserve troops here, backed away to here, um, away as a diversion. That does not work out like he hoped. So he wanted a breakthrough. Ludendorff up here in the north, around Belgium. He wanted a breakthrough here. There was no breakthrough. Um, so he did get far with the tactics to use the barrage. What's it called? The creeping barrage and stormtroops. Oh, there's so much I didn't mention. Oh well. Stormtroops. We're gonna have military units made up between 6 to 8 men. Um, and you keep in barrage with that combined. Because with these small military units, they can move quickly rather than having military units made of 100 men, which move slowly with all together all at once. We have to make sure we're all moving together. With 6 to 8 people, you can move much faster, right? Stormtroops. Um, that's the concept of it. Not Star Wars bullshit. Not to make not to talk shit of Star Wars. Um, I don't know why. Um, it was the first major breakthrough on the western front of the war since its beginning. Defenses were limited. Ludendorff's armies took every casualty. So morale was bad. I sort of mentioned that. And the idea was to take Amiens. It didn't do that. It was a transportation communication center between the British and the French. They fail. They don't do it. I feel like I'm forgetting to mention something. I don't know. I mentioned that. So Paris, of course. So these offensive shocked the British and French. They fought. The Germans are, well depleted by now. They the offensive shocked them. They're like, oh, we have to evacuate. This is game over. The French they don't realize that German troops' morale is completely broken by this point. This is really literally the last throw of the German army. But morale breaks in supreme command of the British and French. And the American Expeditionary Force under General Pershing didn't expect to actually go into battle until 1919. We know the war ends in 1918. He mobilizes the American troops. It's very small, America's divisions, but he's like, we have to get into this battle, and they basically push the Germans away from Paris. If I can find Paris, right, it's like around here. So the Americans end up leading the 1918 offensives. Um, uh, they're full of morale. They're called doughboys, right? Yeah, they're like 1914 men, naive and foolish, and really don't realize how bad and disastrous and bloody this war is. They're completely new to this, but they have that morale, which makes them so much mobile, energetic, and more willing to go on the offensive than the Germans. And this is Ludendorff's last throw. This is the counteroffensive led by in part by the Americans. And this is referred in August, the Black Day of the German Army by Ludendorff. Morale completely collapses. This is the second Battle of the Marne. That's how close they were to Paris, a few miles away. This is the Black Day, the German Army after it, though, Second Battle of Marne, known as the 100 Days Offensives, where the Allied troops pushed the Germans all the way back behind the Hindenburg line. Morale completely collapses in the German army. Battle Amiens, the Black Day of the German army. They couldn't get it, the Amiens. And this is where the Italians come in. Like, they're already losing. The Italians, this is where they get this reputation for being untrustworthy. But since the war is finally over, they're like, oh, we're going to capture all this territory. They didn't capture any territory at all during the war. They were actually pushed back by the Germans and Franz Conrad, but for a bit. But it was during this period where war is basically coming to an end that Italians are grabbing up as much territory as quickly as possible before the armistice comes in. Very very dirty, untrustworthy. And the first power of the break were the Bulgarians. September 30th, the Bulgarians surrendered from the Saloniki campaign finally pulls through in Greece, and then Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, now complete collapse. Surrenders October 30th. Austria-Hungary surrenders or armistice November 4th. Soon to completely collapse Austria-Hungary under Emperor Karl I. I wish I could have got into him, but And then finally, the Germans. Morale completely collapses. Erich von Ludendorff knows this is game over. Morale is completely done for the Germans. Uh, we're going to have a revolution from the above. We're going to have to show we're not going to be monarchy anymore. We're going to be democratic now, right? So the German government is replaced with all these democratic people, particularly Chancellor Max von Baden. He becomes chancellor. And he basically negotiates personally with Wilson on the basis of his 14 points. Wilson was preaching a peace without victory on his 14 points. Have a peace on this. That's the best peace settlement these Germans can get. And but Ludendorff and the military army, he wants friend and the head of the Navy, Franz von Hitler, go to Damelon. I don't think I pronounced it right, but they want a heroic fight to the end for the German soldiers. This is going to be seen in World War II under Hitler. Fight to the end. We're going to keep fighting until we all die, because we are soldiers and we need to preserve our honor. So they want to fight to the end. The German Reichstag, which is basically their parliament, they're like, oh, we don't really want that. We want the war to end. And Ludendorff couldn't agree to this. So he resigns from his position, and he thought Hindenburg was going to follow with him because soldiers honor and all that bullshit. But Hindenburg doesn't. He stays along with the Kaiser. And Ludendorff sees this as an ultimate betrayal. Ludendorff is extremely unpopular by the end of the war. He has to flee disguised as Sweden. And this idea of Gotterdammerung, the head of the Navy, tries to have the German Navy go out in battle. This last heroic fight to the end. And the German Navy in Kiel, and these are German sailors in Wilhelmshaven, they all uprise and they wave the red flag of revolution. We rebel. We're not fighting anymore. This is suicide. You're sending us on a suicidal fight when you know this war is over. And soon after, the Navy revolts or uprises. The German cities of Munich and Berlin uprise as well. So with Erich Ludendorff gone from the picture, he's replaced with Quartermaster General Grollner, and he tallies the German generals. Who is going if the Kaiser has to face a revolt in his home city? Who is going to come and protect him? And all the general, not all of them, like one or two of them, except with the exception of one or two, all of them say we're not sure if our soldiers will follow us to help protect the Kaiser. We're just not certain. So the Kaiser is convinced to flee Germany, and overnight Germany becomes a republic. And right here in this photo, you can see Chancellor Philip Scheidemann proclaiming the German Republic prematurely, with the Kaiser gone from the picture overnight. The German Republic, most peaceful revolution in history, right? Not so much. In retrospect, Germany should have stayed a monarchy, but also the Allied powers wanted to put the Kaiser on trial for war crimes. That would have happened if he stayed in Germany. He is in Holland. He flees to Holland, and the Queen of Holland refuses to hand the Kaiser over to the Allied powers for the so-called mock trial. So on one hand, he does save, I don't know. On one hand, he saves his reputation. On the other, who knows what would have happened if he stayed in Germany? Because on one hand, there are rebellions, and some very dangerous ones. of communists. I forgot the name of the poet, but he overthrows the Wittelsbach monarchy in Bavaria. Germany is facing communist revolutions, and we have to make sure they don't take control over our government like they did in Russia, where everything is completely chaotic in Russia at the end of the war during this period. So they agreed to an armistice. Let me just pop up the terms. Withdraw to the east of the Rhine River, hand over 1,000 pieces, the staging point of invasion for the Germans on French territory, hand over 1,000 pieces of artillery and aircraft, surrender of their African colonies, which are already occupied, and repudiation rejection of the Treaty of West-Litovsk, return them back to the German east border. So all those territories captured by the Russians, they have to give up. The Germans have to retreat. Some of them refused to. They're called Freikorps, German military units that refused to stop fighting. A lot of fighting still going on in 1919 after the war is over, November 11th, 1918. So the war is over. And there are a few points I do want to say about the Treaty of Versailles, even though it's not in this lecture. We as teachers tended to teach the Treaty of Versailles as a prelude to World War II. But in retrospect, it was a very normal treaty, and in concerns to what the military command of Germany was doing. They were planning to be expansionist, and they were trying to deindustrialize their conquered territories. Just to serve an example, the colonization of German Southwest Africa, today called Namibia. What was seen in that colony were genocidal actions, much similar to the ones seen in the Holocaust, where they mass executed the Nama-Nahara people and threw them into concentration camps. That isn't to say that wouldn't happen at all in Europe, but what would have happened in Europe would be the colonization of conquered territories by the Germans. That's exactly what they intended. So on that's one point to make. And on the second point, this idea of a peace without victory, this idea that the Germans could get a victory completely based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points was completely hopeful thinking by the German military command. They knew it was hopeful thinking too. And they would create, after, of course, peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, I say was a fair treaty. We shouldn't teach it like that. It did contribute to Adolf Hitler become popular, but it's just how it is, unfortunately. And because of this defeat and this mass propaganda, what would end up happening in German politics is that many of the right wing, the military men, they would begin preaching this, and Adolf Hitler would be preaching the stab in the back myth. This German Republic that's prematurely proclaimed made peace with our enemies while we were still fighting, which was not true because the German armies completely collapsed and they went on the retreat. It's over. It was over. So in retrospect, the Treaty of Versailles was fair. And the man in charge of the Food Relief Food Relief Administration to Europe was Herbert Hoover. You can see all these areas. Germany is not black, but it was black. Famine conditions. There were mass famine in Germany. All of Central and Eastern Europe experienced mass famine through the years of blockades. Russia particularly, because they faced complete internal collapse, not so much because of the blockades. He's put in Herbert Hoover, who would be a future president of the United States, was put in charge of food relief, and he was very effective. At the beginning of his food relief administration, European nations protested this because Americans were exporting food. They were taking control of these markets that could be ours, even though they needed it. And by the end of 1919, when he said, "We've done enough, the Americans have done enough for the Europeans," they didn't want Herbert Hoover to leave because he was so effective. He did so much. um, to help Europeans recover their broken economies, and they wouldn't really recover to pre-war levels until around 1925. Um, so this is him. Over. Finally, this is a photograph of German veterans of World War One. And at the far left, you could see Adolf Hitler with the X mark. This is Adolf Hitler. He would win 2 Iron Crosses. And the first Battle of Ypres, early on in the war, he courageously went out in the front lines in the middle of complete open fire, where everything's crazy when you could have quickly died just like that to go save his captain. He ended up dying of his wounds anyways, but it was a heroic act by Hitler. And it was even more miraculous that he wasn't wounded at all when he went out in the front lines in open line of fire. Um, he was awarded his first Iron Cross by the Kaiser for that, and he was awarded his second Iron Cross during the German spring offensives in 1918, where he personally captured, I believe, it was about a dozen French soldiers with a lone pistol. He won 2 Iron Crosses, second class the first one, first class for a second one. And he was an ardent nationalist, and he believed personally in this stab in the back myth. Very ethnic nationalist man. Um, and he would not. This would serve as memory for the future of Germany. An entire generation of Germans, old and young. The wounds of World War One would not be forgotten during the interwar period. And that leaves my lecture at that. If anyone stumbles upon this, once my notes, just email me. There's a lot I didn't talk about because I forgot to talk about it, or I just don't simply have had the time to talk about it. But that is the narrative of the Great War from the beginning to the end.